The fog came rolling in over Portland on Christmas Eve 2003, thick and impenetrable, a ghostly shroud settling over the city. Temperatures had plummeted to bone-chilling levels, the kind of cold that seeps beneath layers of clothing and settles into the marrow. Light rain peppered the streets, turning to icy droplets that clung to bare tree branches and holiday decorations. On a quiet residential street bathed in the soft glow of Christmas lights, the Mason family prepared for a short evening trip. Warren Mason, 38, a utility company technician with tired eyes that betrayed long work weeks, checked the tire pressure on their 2002 Ford Explorer. His tall frame bent in concentration as his breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. Inside their modest but festive home, Katie Mason, 36, an elementary school teacher with auburn hair and a gentle demeanor, carefully tied a bright red scarf around the neck of their youngest child. "Is it too tight, Mark?" she asked, adjusting the woolen fabric around her 5-year-old's small neck. The boy, with his mother's hazel eyes and a smattering of freckles across his nose, shook his head, more interested in the promise of finding the perfect pine branch to decorate than the warmth the scarf provided. In the living room, their 2 older children buzzed with the electric excitement that only Christmas could bring. Mason, 12, the serious one with his father's analytical mind, was telling his sister about the science experiment kit he hoped would be under the tree. 9-year-old Mia, with her father's dark hair but her mother's gentle nature, hugged her well-worn teddy bear to her chest, whispering her Christmas wishes into its threadbare ear. "Kids, it's time to go," Warren called from the door, his deep voice carrying through the house. "Bundle up tight. It's freezing out there." None of them could have known that this ordinary family moment would be preserved in amber for nearly 2 decades, a final snapshot of normalcy before the inexplicable. The family of 5 piled into the green Ford Explorer, its nearly new paint gleaming under the streetlights. Warren carefully loaded thin blankets and a few snacks into the trunk. Just enough provisions for their short excursion to find a decorative pine branch from a spot Warren knew along the Columbia Gorge. "Are we going to see Santa?" Mark asked from his car seat, eyes wide with wonder. Warren chuckled, meeting his son's gaze in the rearview mirror. "Not tonight, buddy. Just going to get that special branch for our mantle. But if we're lucky, we might spot one of his reindeer practicing for tomorrow." As Warren turned the key, the engine hummed to life, cutting through the silence of the foggy street. The headlights pierced the thickening mist as the SUV pulled away from their peaceful neighborhood. Christmas lights receding in the distance. They were just another family on a holiday errand, the kind of mundane journey undertaken by countless others that evening across Oregon. At approximately 7 p.m., the Masons stopped at a gas station in Troutdale. The security camera captured grainy footage. Warren pumping gas, his collar turned up against the cold, Katie stepping out to help wipe the rapidly fogging windows, the silhouettes of 3 children in the back seat, their excited movements visible even through the blurry video feed. This fleeting moment, captured by an aging security system, would later become crucial evidence, one of the last verified sightings of the Mason family alive. They continued eastward along Interstate 84, hugging the Columbia River as they drove deeper into the gorge. The windshield wipers worked steadily against the light rain, and Warren kept their speed measured in the limited visibility. The children's excited chatter filled the vehicle, a counterpoint to the rhythm of the wipers and the soft Christmas music playing from the radio. What none of them noticed, what no one could have noticed, was that as they continued their journey into the fog, they were driving toward a mystery that would haunt Oregon for nearly 20 years. By 8 p.m., the Mason family pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe in Hood River. The modest establishment, with its steamed-up windows and warm yellow lights, offered a welcome respite from the increasingly hostile weather outside. A hand-painted wooden sign swung gently in the wind, River's Edge Cafe, estimated 1978. Inside, the warm aroma of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. The cafe was only half full, a few truckers hunched over steaming mugs at the counter, while scattered couples and lone travelers occupied tables near the fog-obscured windows. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with homemade ornaments, its multicolored lights reflecting in the glass. Linda Cross, a waitress in her mid-30s with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, greeted the Mason family as they entered, stomping their feet against the cold. "Y'all look half frozen," she said warmly, leading them to an empty table near the back. "Christmas Eve's no night to be out in weather like this." Warren Mason smiled, his arm protectively around 5-year-old Mark. "Just a quick stop before we head a little further up to get our Christmas branch." Family tradition. Katie helped the children settle into the booth, unwinding scarves and removing gloves. Mason and Mia immediately began eyeing the display of cookies near the register, while Mark pressed his small nose against the window, trying unsuccessfully to see through the condensation. Linda brought hot chocolate for the children and coffee for the adults. "On the house," she insisted when Warren reached for his wallet. "It's Christmas Eve after all." As Linda moved away to attend to other customers, she noticed something that would later haunt her memories for years to come. A man sitting alone in the far corner of the cafe, his broad shoulders hunched over a cooling mug of coffee. What caught her attention wasn't just his solitary presence on a holiday evening, but the intensity with which he was watching the Mason family. His eyes, dark and unblinking beneath the shadow of a baseball cap, never left Warren Mason. Not the casual glance of a stranger observing a family, but something more calculated, more focused. A cold, unwavering stare filled with what Linda would later describe as pure hatred. The man was stocky, with short brown hair visible beneath his cap. He wore a dark jacket zipped to the neck, and his large hands were wrapped so tightly around his mug that his knuckles had turned white. When Warren laughed at something Katie said, Linda saw the man's jaw clench, a muscle twitching visibly in his cheek. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down Linda's spine. She deliberately positioned herself between the stranger's line of sight and the Mason family as she refilled their drinks. A protective instinct she couldn't explain but would never forget. After about 30 minutes, Warren glanced at his watch. "We should get going if we want to find that branch before it gets too late," he told his family, leaving a generous tip beneath his empty mug. As they gathered their things, bundling the children back into their coats and scarves, Katie tied Mark's bright red scarf securely around his small neck. "Can't have you catch a cold on Christmas," she said, planting a kiss on his forehead. Linda watched them leave, the bell above the door jingling as they stepped back into the fog. Through the window, she could see the headlights of their green SUV flare to life in the parking lot before slowly disappearing into the thick mist along Highway 35. When she turned back to clear their table, she noticed with a start that the corner seat was empty. The stranger had vanished without paying his bill, his half-empty coffee mug the only evidence he had been there at all. Linda Cross had no way of knowing that she had just witnessed the last public sighting of the Mason family, or that the dark-eyed stranger would become central to one of Oregon's most haunting mysteries. The Mason family's Ford Explorer pulled away from River's Edge Cafe at approximately 9 p.m., heading east into the densest fog the Columbia Gorge had seen in years. From that moment, all 5 members of the Mason family vanished without a trace, their headlights swallowed by the impenetrable white void of Christmas Eve, 2003. And with that disappearance, a chilling echo would reverberate through Oregon for the next 20 years. Christmas morning, 2003. While most of Portland awoke to the sounds of excited children and the rustle of gift wrap, Rebecca Cole sat by her phone, a growing sense of dread building in her chest. She had called her sister Katie's cell phone 7 times since 8 a.m. Each call rolled to voicemail after 6 rings, Katie's cheerful greeting becoming more ominous with each repetition. "Something's wrong," Rebecca whispered to her husband as she set down the phone for the 8th time. "They always call on Christmas morning. Always." By noon, Rebecca had called the Masons' home phone as well, listening to the endless ringing with mounting panic. She drove to their house, finding it eerily silent. Christmas lights still blinking on the porch, presents untouched beneath the tree, visible through the front window. Their house looked frozen in time, as if the family had simply stepped out and would return any moment. At 2:37 p.m., Rebecca Cole placed a call to the Portland Police Department, her voice breaking as she reported, "My sister and her entire family have been missing since last night. Something terrible has happened." "I know it." The responding officer tried to reassure her that they had probably gone to visit other relatives or experience car trouble in the bad weather. Adults, after all, had the right to go where they pleased, and 24 hours hadn't yet elapsed. But Rebecca's insistence, and the fact that 3 young children were involved prompted him to file a preliminary report. They were going to the Columbia Gorge for a pine branch, Rebecca explained, clutching a framed photo of the Mason family from the previous summer. It's their tradition. They should have been home hours ago. By nightfall on Christmas Day, the Portland Police Department had forwarded the report to the Oregon State Police. The unusual nature of the case, an entire family of 5 missing on Christmas Day, combined with the severe weather conditions of the previous night, elevated the situation from routine to concerning. Dawn on December 26th saw an emergency meeting convened at the Multnomah County Emergency Operations Center. Under harsh fluorescent lights, a large map was spread across a conference table, red pins marking the route from Portland through Troutdale to Hood River and the Dalles. Officers in uniform and plainclothes detectives huddled around, coffee cups in hand, voices low and serious. "We're not treating this as a simple delay," announced Captain Michaels, his weathered face grim. "An entire family, including 3 minor children, has vanished. Their home is untouched. No credit card activity since the gas station in Troutdale and a cafe purchase in Hood River at 8:17 p.m. on the 24th. No cell phone pings since approximately 9:30 p.m. in the vicinity of the Columbia Gorge." He didn't need to state what everyone in the room already knew. Without a lead in the first 72 hours, the chances of finding the Mason family alive diminished drastically. By 8:00 a.m., the first search helicopter lifted off from Troutdale Airport, flying low along the I-84 corridor despite lingering fog. From above, the Columbia River appeared as a churning gray ribbon cutting through steep, mist-covered cliffs. The pilot swept powerful spotlights over treacherous curves and riverside pullouts, places where a vehicle might have veered off-road. "Nothing unusual," the pilot radioed back. "A few parked trucks at the rest areas, some empty lots, but no sign of a green Ford Explorer." On the ground, search teams fanned out along the highway. Officers in waterproof gear and bright yellow vests examined guardrails for impact damage, peered over edges with powerful flashlights, and studied the muddy embankments for tire tracks. K-9 units were deployed at rest stops between Troutdale and Hood River, trained dogs sniffing for any trace of the Mason family. At one point, the dogs alerted strongly near a damp patch by a scenic viewpoint, but a quick test revealed it was just fluid leakage from a recent commercial vehicle. Meanwhile, analysts at command headquarters pieced together what little information they had. The gas station receipt confirmed Warren Mason had filled the tank at 7:15 p.m. on December 24th. Security footage showed him, Katie, and glimpses of the children in the backseat of the Explorer. A credit card transaction at River's Edge Cafe in Hood River was time-stamped 8:17 p.m., a purchase of 2 coffees and 3 hot chocolates. Then came the cafe footage. Although grainy and limited in scope, it clearly showed the Mason family entering at 8:05 p.m., sitting at a corner table, and leaving at 8:52 p.m. The 5 of them walked to the parking lot, climbed into their SUV, and the headlights disappeared into the fog. After 8:52 p.m., the trail went cold. No more credit card transactions, no further confirmed sightings, no reliable witnesses. "It's as if they drove off the face of the earth," muttered one detective, staring at the final frames of the security footage. The first 48 hours of the search yielded nothing. Helicopter teams continued scanning, their lights cutting through the rainy December darkness. Divers searched deep sections of the river near particularly dangerous curves, battling currents so strong they could barely see their hands in front of their faces. They recovered rusted metal, old tires, even a sunken rowboat. None of it related to the Mason family. By December 28th, after 72 hours of fruitless searching, a grim silence had settled over the command center. The compiled report landed on Captain Michaels' desk. No vehicle, no bodies, no evidence of a crash. Not a single clue suggested what had happened after the Masons left the cafe in Hood River. As tense glances met across the room, a veteran detective finally voiced what everyone had begun to consider. "If this wasn't an accident, we have to consider it might be a crime." The words hung in the air, changing the tenor of the investigation and opening a darker chapter in the search for the Mason family. The haunting truth was that the Oregon wilderness, with its steep gorges and churning river, could easily conceal an SUV for years or forever. The winter fog that had swallowed the Mason family might never relinquish its secret. As the calendar turned to January 2004, the search for the Mason family intensified. The Columbia River, ancient and unforgiving, became the central focus. Its currents had claimed lives before on, vehicles occasionally vanishing into its depths only to be discovered years later. On a brutally cold morning, a specialized dive team was dispatched to the Dallas Marina, a location flagged on search maps due to a particularly sharp curve nearby where the guardrail showed signs of previous impacts. The dive coordinator, a grizzled veteran named Thompson with 20 years of water recovery experience, briefed his team with grim efficiency. Visibility underwater will be near zero, less than 3 feet. Currents running strong today. We'll use the grid search pattern, quadrants alpha through echo. Any sign of the explorer, tires, glass, metal, you radio immediately. Remember, we're not just looking for a vehicle, we're looking for a family. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the frigid air. At this point, they were likely looking for bodies. Rescue boats anchored near the marina as divers in heavy cold water gear checked oxygen tanks and tethering lines. The Columbia River churned beneath them, its surface deceptively calm, while underwater currents raged with frightening strength. As divers plunged into the icy water, their flashlights cast weak yellow beams that were quickly swallowed by the murky sediment. They groped along safety lines, inching forward through the frigid darkness, feeling their way across rocks, waterlogged wood, and countless nameless objects embedded in the riverbed. Above, police officers watched air bubbles rise in small clusters, the only evidence the divers were still below. After 40 minutes of searching a 200-meter radius from the marina, the divers surfaced with only an old tire wedged between rocks, its rubber decayed and serial number long eroded. Quick analysis confirmed it wasn't from a 2002 SUV. Diving conditions impossible, Thompson reported, his face ruddy from cold. Visibility under 3 feet, current strong enough to pull a grown man. No signs of the Ford Explorer. We recovered one unrelated tire, some rusted cans, abandoned fishing gear. In the margin of his report, Captain Michaels scrawled a chilling note. If the car entered the river, it may have been swept far downstream. That stark sentence silenced the emergency operations room. It meant they weren't just searching one location, but potentially miles of river with countless eddies, depths, and hidden underwater features. Over the following days, smaller teams continued diving at strategic points along the river, while helicopters maintained aerial searches when weather permitted. Forensic technicians created models simulating where a vehicle might drift if it entered the river at various points along the Masons' presumed route. The range stretched from Hood River all the way to Bonneville Dam, a vast area that would require resources far beyond what the department could sustain. By mid-January, the search had yielded nothing. The Mason family remained as vanished as they had been on Christmas morning, their absence a growing weight on the community. In Portland, Rebecca Cole fought tirelessly to keep her sister's family in the public consciousness. She organized the first candlelight vigil on January 15th outside Portland City Hall, where hundreds gathered in the winter rain, holding photographs of the missing family and white candles that struggled to remain lit in the wind. "They're out there somewhere," Rebecca told the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes. "My sister, her husband, my nieces and nephew, they exist. They matter. And we will not stop looking until we find them." As weeks stretched into months with no new leads, the media's attention waned. By February, the daily updates became weekly, then monthly. The Oregon State Police maintained an active investigation, but resources were gradually reallocated to newer cases with fresher leads. The community's initial shock and outpouring of support began to fade into a background sadness, the kind of lingering unresolved grief that attaches itself to places and becomes part of their identity. Portland newspapers occasionally ran retrospective pieces, 1 month since the Mason family disappearance, then 100 days missing, each headline marking the passage of time without answers. For Rebecca Cole, however, time stopped on Christmas Day 2003. She maintained a relentless schedule of meetings with police, media appearances, and community events. She established a foundation in her sister's name, dedicated to improving search and rescue resources in the Columbia Gorge region. The river knows, she would say when asked why she refused to give up, and someday it will tell us. As the initial search for the Mason family stalled, investigators turned their attention to the people in the Masons' lives. If this wasn't a tragic accident along the treacherous Columbia Gorge, then who might have had reason to harm an elementary school teacher, a utility technician, and their three young children? Detective Dan Park, a methodical investigator with 15 years of experience and a reputation for solving cold cases, led the effort to map the Masons' connections. In a small room at Oregon State Police headquarters, he created a network diagram. Friends, co-workers, relatives, acquaintances, anyone who might shed light on the family's final hours or potential conflicts in their lives. The Masons were well-liked, Park noted during a briefing in March 2004. Warren's co-workers describe him as reliable, hardworking. Katie was popular among parents and fellow teachers. No known enemies, no significant debts except their mortgage. By all accounts, a normal, stable family. But as Park dug deeper into the Masons' neighborhood connections, one name began to surface repeatedly: Charlie Chuck Daniels. Living 3 houses down from the Masons in a Portland suburb, Daniels was in his mid-40s, stocky, with short brown hair thinning at the temples. A former construction worker, often between jobs, he had been a peripheral figure in the neighborhood for years. What caught Park's attention was a financial connection. Bank records showed that Warren Mason had loaned Daniels $15,000 in early 2003 for what was described as a business opportunity. The business, a small landscaping venture, had failed within months, and according to neighbors, Daniels had been unable or unwilling to repay the loan. There was an argument, reported Janet Weber, who lived between the Mason and Daniels homes. Late September or early October, right out on the front lawn. I've never seen Warren that angry. Chuck was shouting back, saying Warren didn't understand, that he just needed more time. Another neighbor, Michael Ferris, recalled more chilling details. Chuck yelled something like, "You'll regret underestimating me." It was the kind of thing you notice, not normal neighborhood disagreement language. This information prompted Park to examine Daniel's background more thoroughly. What emerged was troubling: a pattern of financial failures, short-lived jobs, mounting debts, and a history of volatile behavior when drinking. More concerning were 2 prior assaults charges from bar fights, both settled with probation. The psychological profile that emerged painted Daniels as a man struggling with deep-seated issues of inadequacy, prone to explosive anger, when his self-image was threatened, and increasingly isolated as his financial situation deteriorated. On January 2, 2004, Park and another detective visited Daniels' home for questioning. The small house stood in stark contrast to the well-maintained Mason residence. Peeling paint, an overgrown yard littered with dead leaves, blinds perpetually drawn. Daniels answered the door unshaven, bloodshot eyes betraying either lack of sleep or recent drinking. Inside, empty beer cans and fast food containers suggested a life in disarray. "I was home alone on Christmas Eve," Daniels insisted when questioned about his whereabouts. "Watching the game, had a few beers, didn't go anywhere." The problem was he had no witnesses to back his alibi. No friends or family had visited, and neighbors didn't recall seeing lights or hearing a television from his house that evening. When Park pressed him about the $15,000 loan and the argument with Warren, Daniels grew defensive. "Yeah, I owed him some money, so what? Half the neighborhood's in debt. Doesn't mean I did anything to the guy." "What about the threat?" Park asked. "Witnesses say you told Warren he'd regret underestimating you." "Those are pretty strong words." Daniels waved dismissively. "Heat of the moment, man. Just guy stuff. Everyone argues about money." Throughout the interview, Park noted Daniels' shifting gaze, the way he fidgeted with a lighter, his defensive posture. Classic signs of deception, or possibly just the natural nervousness of someone being questioned in connection with a high-profile disappearance. "You seem pretty calm about a family of 5 vanishing," Park observed toward the end of the interview. "Weren't you and Warren friends at one point?" Something flickered behind Daniel's eyes, a moment of genuine emotion breaking through the facade. "We were neighbors, not friends," he said flatly. "And yeah, it's terrible what happened, but I had nothing to do with it." Nothing. A search of Daniel's home revealed no physical evidence connecting him to the Mason family's disappearance. His old pickup truck showed no signs of recent long-distance travel or of towing or transporting another vehicle. In his report, Park wrote, Charles Chuck Daniels has a financial motive, $15,000 debt, and documented conflict with Warren Mason. However, no direct evidence exists linking him to the disappearance. His claim of being home alone on Christmas Eve is neither verified nor refuted. Insufficient grounds for arrest at this time. When Rebecca Cole was informed about Daniels, she broke down in tears, recalling conversations with Katie about their neighbor. She mentioned him hanging around their house, always asking Warren for more money or more time. She felt uncomfortable around him. I should have paid more attention. Throughout spring 2004, Park continued monitoring Daniels, but without evidence, the investigation stalled. Daniels remained in the neighborhood, even attending one of Rebecca's prayer vigils, standing silently at the back of the crowd as if uninvolved. To the community, his continued presence was both unsettling and infuriating, but the law couldn't touch him without evidence. The first serious suspect in the Mason family's disappearance continued his life in plain sight, while 5 people remained missing without a trace. As the case file grew thicker with reports, interviews, and dead-end leads, a summary line was typed on the final page of the initial investigation. Charlie Daniels, primary person of interest, no physical evidence, cannot prosecute at this time. The Mason family had vanished into the Christmas fog, and with each passing month, the truth seemed to recede further into the mist, a mystery that would haunt Oregon for years to come. By February 2004, the once urgent investigation into the Mason family's disappearance had produced a thick but ultimately empty case file. After the initial flurry of searches, hundreds of helicopter hours, dozens of high-risk dives, and countless man-hours on the ground, the Oregon State Police faced mounting budget pressures and the demands of newer cases. The media spotlight, once so intensely focused on the family of 5 who vanished on Christmas Eve, gradually dimmed. Television crews no longer stationed themselves outside the Mason home, and newspaper coverage moved from front-page headlines to brief updates buried deep within the local section. In early March, Captain Michaels called a meeting with the core investigation team. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room, faces that had once been animated with determination now showed the weight of defeat. "I'm not saying we're closing the case," Michaels announced, his voice heavy, "but we need to be realistic about resource allocation. As of today, the Mason investigation moves to secondary status." The team understood what this meant. Officers reassigned, budget slashed, the daily pursuit of leads reduced to occasional follow-ups. The investigation wouldn't officially end, but it would fade into the background, becoming one of the many unsolved cases that haunt police departments across the country. Detective Dan Park lingered after the others had left, staring at the corkboard where photographs of the Mason family were pinned alongside maps of the Columbia Gorge and a timeline of their final known hours. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered, tracing the route with his finger. "A car doesn't just vanish with 5 people inside." Michael sighed, gathering papers into a folder. Maybe it was just what it looked like from the start, a terrible accident on a foggy night. The rivers claimed vehicles before. Sometimes they never resurface. And Daniels, the neighbor with the debt and the argument? Without evidence connecting him to the scene, we've got nothing actionable. Michaels placed a hand on Park's shoulder. "Look, I know you're invested, but sometimes cases don't get solved, not for years, sometimes never. You've been at this long enough to know that." Later that night, in the solitude of his apartment, Park opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, he wrote, "High likelihood the Mason family was murdered. Perpetrator likely someone known to them with direct conflict with Warren. Charlie Daniels needs monitoring." This note never made it into official reports, but it reflected the lingering torment of those who saw the case stall. Even as the investigation cooled, Park maintained unofficial surveillance of Daniels, noting the man's increasingly erratic behavior, missed work shifts, growing isolation, more frequent bar visits. Outside the official channels, Rebecca Cole refused to let her sister's family be forgotten. She organized the first anniversary candlelight vigil on Christmas Eve 2004, drawing hundreds to the steps of Portland City Hall. Faces illuminated by flickering candles, they sang carols Katie had taught her elementary students, while large photographs of the family stood on easels, their smiling faces a painful contrast to the solemnity of the gathering. "My sister and her family are still out there," Rebecca told the crowd, her voice clear despite the cold. "Whether they're still with us or have been taken to heaven, they deserve to be found. They deserve justice." The vigils became an annual tradition, though each year saw fewer attendees. From hundreds in the early years to several dozen by the late 2000s, the dwindling crowds reflected the natural erosion of public memory. Only a core group of family, close friends, and a few dedicated community members maintained their vigil as the years passed. Between 2005 and 2006, sporadic leads emerged, each briefly rekindling hope before flickering out. A hiker claimed to have seen a green SUV on a remote trail near Hood River, but a search revealed nothing. A fisherman reported pulling up suspicious metal fragments near Bonneville Dam, but analysis showed them to be unrelated industrial debris. Each fleeting promise of resolution only deepened the community's unease. The media began referring to the Masons as the vanished Christmas family, a headline-grabbing moniker that acknowledged both the public's fascination and the likelihood that answers might never come. By 2007, funding for the investigation was officially reduced to minimal levels. At a press conference in September, the Multnomah County Sheriff admitted, "We've done all we can with available resources, but we can no longer justify expanded search operations without new evidence." The statement struck Rebecca Cole like a physical blow. Seated in the audience, she wept silently, clutching a photo of Katie and the children. But in her tears was a fiery determination. Without her efforts, the world might forget the Masons entirely. She vowed that day to never let that happen, no matter how many years passed. In 2008, after 5 years of stagnation, the Mason file was officially transferred to the Oregon State Police's Cold Case Unit. The internal memo was brief and bureaucratic. All active investigation efforts exhausted. Mason case classified as cold, pending new evidence. To many young officers, it was just paperwork, another folder added to the archives of unsolved mysteries. But for those who had lived with the case for 5 years, it was a bitter admission that time had swallowed all traces of the truth. The day the file was shelved in the Cold Case Unit's archive room, Dan Park, now nearing retirement, quietly entered. He placed his hand on the worn folder and slipped his old notebook inside, a message for whoever might reopen the case. "Don't forget to look at known associates with a financial grudge. The truth is there." Outside, Oregon's persistent rain fell steadily, just like that fateful Christmas Eve in 2003. In that cold gloom, the Mason case officially went dormant. A true cold case, waiting years for a catalyst to reawaken it. In December 2013, as the 10th anniversary of the Mason family's disappearance approached, Oregon's attention returned to the long-dormant case. The Oregonian launched an ambitious series titled Cold Cases of Oregon, highlighting unsolved mysteries that had shaped the state's collective memory. The Mason case topped the list. Young reporter Rachel Morris, ambitious and meticulous, was assigned to trace the chilling disappearance that had captivated Oregon a decade earlier. Her first step was to contact retired Detective Dan Park, who had led the early investigation. Park, now in his 70s with a shock of white hair and a leaner frame, lived with his wife in a small wooden house near Salem. When Rachel arrived for the interview, she found him waiting on the porch in an old wooden chair, a file folder labeled Warren Mason Case 2003 resting on his lap. "I've been expecting someone to call," he said, his voice roughened by age but his eyes still sharp. 10 years is a nice round number for the media. Makes for good headlines." Over coffee in his modest living room, surrounded by photographs of grandchildren and fishing trophies, Park recounted the chaotic early days of the investigation. He described the helicopters sweeping the Columbia Gorge, divers groping in murky water, dozens of witnesses questioned with no clear leads. "We initially thought it was an accident," he explained, gesturing with gnarled hands. "The obvious theory, car plunged into the river swept away by currents. But as we dug deeper, the evidence pointed to something else." "Like what?" Rachel asked, recorder running on the coffee table between them. Park's expression darkened. Warren had enemies, or at least one enemy. Charlie Daniels was the most prominent, owed Warren $15,000, had a public confrontation with him just months before the disappearance. Rachel flipped through her notes. There was a rumor about a witness seeing Daniels in Hood River on December 24th, 2003, at the cafe where the Mason family was last seen. Was that ever confirmed? Park nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. Linda Cross, the waitress, she described a stocky man with brown hair, about 40, sitting in the corner. Said he was staring at Warren the entire time they were there, with what she called hate in his eyes. Why wasn't that pursued? Rachel pressed. We recorded her statement but couldn't go further. The security footage had been overwritten before we could review it. No photographs existed of the man in the cafe. When we added it to the file, prosecutors said it was too circumstantial for court. Park sighed heavily. It was the investigation's biggest blind spot. A witness placing Daniels at the critical location and time, but no physical evidence to confirm it. He leaned forward, voice dropping to nearly a whisper. If we'd had better cameras, if we'd secured that footage in time, things might have been different. When Rachel asked if he truly believed Daniels was responsible, Park paused, staring out at the rain-soaked garden beyond his window. I can't say for certain, he finally replied, but my instincts after 30 years of detective work tell me he knew more than he let on. A man in serious debt who publicly threatened the victim, and who a witness placed at the right location at the right time? That's not just coincidence. The Oregonian article, published on December 20th, 2013, sparked immediate public outcry. Its bold headline read, "Retired detective reveals overlooked detail in Mason disappearance," with Park quoted directly, "If we'd had stronger evidence of Daniels' presence in Hood River, the case would have taken an entirely different path." The statement spread rapidly across social media, thrusting Daniels, who had since relocated from Portland to a small town in eastern Oregon, back into the spotlight of public suspicion. Rebecca Cole, now showing the strain of a decade spent advocating for her missing family, read the article by candlelight at the 10th anniversary vigil. Her hands trembled as she processed Park's words. "I knew it," she whispered to a reporter covering the event. "I always knew he was involved, but for years no one listened." Within the police force, the article sparked heated debate. Some officers felt Park had overstepped, breaking the unwritten code of not publicly questioning past investigations. But younger recruits saw his words as a call to action, evidence that the case deserved fresh eyes. In her reporter's notebook that night, Rachel Morris wrote a private reflection. 10 years on, the Mason case remains officially unsolved, but Daniels' alleged presence in the witness account, a mere stare in a cafe, is enough to chill an entire community. If it was truly him, the Mason family was being watched in their final moments. That seemingly minor detail, a witness account of a hateful stare, planted a seed for investigations years later, when forensic technology and a new generation of detectives would enter the fray. The 10th anniversary coverage rekindled public interest, if only temporarily. For the first time in years, people across Oregon discussed the Mason family around dinner tables and in coffee shops, wondering anew what had become of them and whether justice would ever be served. In the wake of renewed attention, the Oregon State Police issued a statement reaffirming that the case remained open, if inactive, and that new leads would be investigated should they emerge. It was a standard response, offered with little expectation that anything would change. No one could have predicted that 6 years later, an unexpected breakthrough would come not from police work, but from a group of civilian divers with advanced technology and a passion for solving cold cases. 6 years after the 2013 article rekindled painful memories, the Mason case had once again faded among Oregon's hundreds of unsolved mysteries. But in fall 2019, an unexpected breakthrough came from outside the law enforcement community. Oregon Underwater Recovery, a volunteer group of experienced divers, had formed in 2017 with a mission to locate submerged vehicles and assist authorities in recovering evidence from Oregon's numerous waterways. These civilian explorers, equipped with modern side-scan sonar technology, usually reserved for oil exploration, spent weekends mapping the Columbia River's hidden contours. Mark Harper, the group's founder and a veteran diver with 20 years' experience, had a personal connection to the Mason case. "I grew up in their neighborhood," he explained when asked why he was obsessed with the 16-year-old disappearance. "That Christmas Eve, the whole area felt frozen in grief. Every time I dive in the gorge, I think of them." On September 14, 2019, under Oregon's overcast skies and the biting winds that perpetually sweep through the Columbia Gorge, Oregon Underwater Recovery set out in their customized boat. The day's mission, to survey the area near the Dalles Marina, one of the locations where police divers had searched unsuccessfully in early 2004. Technology has advanced dramatically since the original search, Harper told his team as they prepared the equipment. We can see details now that weren't possible back then. They lowered their side-scan sonar device along the boat's starboard side, activating the system that would send acoustic pulses through the water and analyze the returning signals to create detailed 3D images of the riverbed. The technology, originally designed for industrial purposes, had been repurposed for their nonprofit mission. The sonar display showed familiar distorted shapes, rocks, fallen trees, scattered debris. The team moved slowly along the south bank of the Dalles, focusing on an area approximately 70 feet deep, where the river's currents created a natural collection point for objects swept downstream. After nearly 2 hours of methodical scanning, an anomalous image appeared on the screen. Beneath the dark shadow of the riverbed, a roughly 4-meter-long boxy object with round, wheel-like protrusions stood out from the surrounding natural features. "Stop! Hold position!" Harper shouted, pointing at the screen. The team crowded around, eyes fixed on the unmistakable outline. Repeated sonar sweeps from different angles sharpened the image. A metallic object tilted at an angle, with one end partially sunken into the mud and the other protruding slightly. The shape was distinct from the natural contours of river rocks or fallen trees. "This isn't natural," one team member murmured, "and it's not a boat." Preliminary measurements, approximately 4 meters long by 2 meters wide, matched the dimensions of a mid-size SUV, like an early 2000s Ford Explorer. The team's excitement was tempered by the sobering realization of what they might have found. They marked the exact GPS coordinates, logging them precisely into their system. Multiple scans from different angles confirmed this wasn't a sonar artifact or glitch. The results were consistent across all readings. A box-like object with 4 round structures resembling wheels resting silently under the Columbia River for over 15 years. "If it's the car," one diver said quietly, "they might still be inside." The words hushed the group. Each understood the weight of their discovery and its grim implications. This wasn't just another sunken object. It potentially held the answer to one of Oregon's most haunting mysteries. Harper made the decision immediately. "We need to report this to the police. This isn't a game anymore." The next day, Oregon State Police received a formal report from Oregon Underwater Recovery, including printed sonar images and the exact GPS coordinates near the Dalles Marina. Duty officers stared at the black and white image of a vehicle-like shape resting on the riverbed, immediately recognizing its potential significance. The official report was brief but weighty. "Suspicious object detected at coordinates 45D 3612.8. N121 DG 1044 W, approximately 4 meters long, box-shaped at 70 feet depth, likely a submerged vehicle. Urgent verification needed." For officers who had been connected to the Mason file over the years, this was the first real lead in over a decade, a potential breakthrough sparked not by state resources, but by the persistence of civilian volunteers with advanced technology. As news leaked to local media, headlines appeared. "Dive group finds suspected car in Columbia River. Possible break in Mason case." The public's memories of the 2003 disappearance resurged, along with the painful questions that had never been answered. Rebecca Cole, now in her 50s with gray streaking her once dark hair, was contacted by a local reporter. Through tears, she said simply, "I pray it's them, so we can finally bring my family home." That night in the cold case unit office, the Mason file was pulled from the archives for the first time in years. The red cold case label glared starkly against the manila folder. But inside, young officers flipped through pages with renewed interest, eyes scanning old reports and witness statements with fresh perspective. On the first page of what would become the new phase of the investigation, they taped a small note. 20 GPS coordinates identify suspected Mason vehicle at the Dalles Marina. The discovery marked a pivotal moment. the point where technology and civilian tenacity breathed new life into one of Oregon's coldest cases. But the challenges ahead were formidable. Recovering a vehicle from such depths after so many years presented enormous technical difficulties, and the emotional weight of what might be found inside loomed over everyone involved. For the first time in 16 years, there was a tangible lead, a physical location where answers might finally lie. The Columbia River, which had kept its secret for nearly 2 decades, might at last be forced to reveal the truth about what happened on that foggy Christmas Eve in 2003. In January 2020, as planning began for the complex recovery operation at the Dalles Marina, a new figure entered the Mason case. Detective Megan Harlow, 32, had recently transferred to the cold case unit from Violent Crimes Division. With blonde hair typically pulled back in a practical ponytail and penetrating green eyes that missed little, Harlow had gained a reputation for innovative approaches to seemingly unsolvable cases. Captain Reynolds called her into his office on a rainy Tuesday morning. "I'm assigning you to the Mason case," he said without preamble, sliding a thick folder across his desk. "You've probably heard about the sonar discovery. We're planning a recovery operations for spring when the river conditions improve." Harlow had indeed followed the news about Oregon underwater recovery's find. Like most Oregonians who'd grown up in the state, she knew the basic outlines of the Mason disappearance, a family vanishing on Christmas Eve, never to be seen again. "Why me?" she asked, already leafing through the file. "This case has a lot of history." "That's precisely why," Reynolds replied. "We need fresh eyes, someone not married to old theories or approaches, someone willing to look at everything again, from scratch." In truth, Harlow's assignment was strategic. As the youngest detective in the cold case unit, she brought not only fresh perspective, but expertise in modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed when the Masons disappeared. Her graduate work in forensic technology made her uniquely qualified to handle evidence that would challenge traditional methods. She accepted the assignment without hesitation. "I'll need everything, all files, all interviews, all evidence logs, and I want to talk to everyone still alive who was involved in the original investigation." For the next several months, while technical teams planned the complex vehicle recovery, Harlow lived in the case files. She commandeered a small, windowless room at headquarters, transforming it into a war room dedicated solely to the Mason investigation. A large whiteboard dominated one wall, where she created a detailed timeline. December 24th, 2003. Disappearance. December 25-27, 2003. Initial search failure. January 2004. Daniels interrogation. 2008. Case moved to cold case unit. 2019. Sonar detection. Under each milestone, she taped relevant photos, witness statements, and forensic reports. As the board filled with information, Harlow noticed a pattern emerging. Not random events, but a chain of oversights, missed leads, and paths not taken. One name appeared with striking frequency: Charlie Chuck Daniels. First, in a neighbor's statement about his $15,000 debt to Warren Mason. Then in the January 2004 interrogation. Next in the Hood River Cafe workers' account. And later in Dan Park's 2013 interview. Though each mention lacked enough evidence to build a case, the persistent recurrence of Daniels' name throughout the file made Harlow pause. She wrote boldly on the board, "Daniels, central suspect." In the original files, she found Park's handwritten note, nearly forgotten among official reports. "High likelihood of murder. Perpetrator likely known to victims. Daniels needs monitoring." A chill ran through her as she read the words. This wasn't just a veteran's hunch, but the seed of a neglected investigative path. To ensure nothing was missed, Harlow meticulously reviewed the 2004 Daniels interrogation transcript. It noted his claim of being home alone on Christmas Eve, unverified by any witness. When pressed about the debt, Daniels had grown defensive and angry. A detective's marginal note stood out. Subject showed hostility, evasiveness, uncooperative behavior. Harlow triple underlined hostility on her notes. Next, she studied Linda Cross's statement describing the man at the cafe, stocky, brown-haired, about 40, staring intently at Warren Mason. Though the security footage had been overwritten, the physical description matched Daniels' 2003 appearance too closely to ignore. "Why was this overlooked?" Harlow muttered, drawing a connecting arrow from Hood River Cafe to Daniels on her board. For 3 days, she barely left the file room. Mornings, she read reports and analyzed evidence logs. Afternoons, she pinned notes and mapped relationships. The Mason family remained at the center of her diagram, surrounded by concentric circles of connections. Neighbors, co-workers, friends, witnesses. Only one name created a pattern of concerning intersections: Daniels, with his debt, the argument, the cafe sighting, and his lack of alibi. Though no forensic evidence yet tied him directly to the disappearance, the pattern suggested a focal point of suspicion that warranted deeper investigation once the vehicle was recovered. On a cold February morning, Harlow held her first internal briefing for superiors. She presented the relationship map, pointing to Daniels's recurring presence throughout the investigation. Some veteran officers frowned. "We investigated him thoroughly in 2004, one objected. There was nothing concrete there." Harlow nodded, undeterred. "Back then, technology was limited. Now we have advanced DNA analysis, facial recognition, trace evidence capabilities. If Daniels left anything in that car, anything at all, we'll find it." Her confident tone silenced the room momentarily. Captain Reynolds nodded his approval. "Fine, pursue that angle. But remember, we need evidence, not just patterns or instinct." That night in her small apartment in Salem, Harlow sat by the window watching rain streak the glass. On her laptop screen, Daniels' name glowed in bold letters. A man who had eluded suspicion for 16 years, despite appearing at every significant turn in the investigation. She knew she was entering dangerous territory, potentially reopening wounds and confronting a man who had lived freely for nearly 2 decades while 5 people remained missing. But to Harlow, this persistent pattern couldn't be mere coincidence. The next morning, she submitted a formal request to the forensic lab. When the vehicle was recovered, all trace evidence should be compared to Daniels' fingerprints and DNA from his current residence in Eastern Oregon. It was the start of a new chapter, one Harlow believed could finally answer Oregon's nearly 2-decade-old question: what happened to the Mason family on Christmas Eve, 2003? As spring approached and river conditions began to improve, preparations accelerated for the recovery operation. Harlow found herself caught between impatience for answers and the methodical demands of proper investigative procedure. The Columbia River had held its secret for 17 years. A few more months of careful planning would ensure they didn't lose crucial evidence when the vehicle finally emerged from the depths. In May 2021, nearly 2 years after Oregon underwater recovery provided the GPS coordinates, the Oregon State Police launched a massive recovery operation at the Dalles Marina. The spring season had calmed the Columbia's icy rage somewhat, but the river still churned with powerful currents, guarding its secrets beneath layers of silt and mud. At dawn, dozens of officers, forensic technicians, and professional divers gathered at the marina under a pale blue sky. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, while a few local reporters waited behind barricades, cameras ready. Everyone present understood the gravity of the moment. This could be the first time in 18 years that the truth about the Mason family might finally surface. Detective Megan Harlow stood on the dock, her blonde hair whipping in the wind off the river, watching as the recovery team made final preparations. She had fought hard for this operation, convincing superiors to allocate the substantial resources required for such a complex underwater recovery. Water temperature is 42 degrees, visibility approximately 3 feet, current moderate to strong, the dive coordinator announced during the final briefing. "Our priority is preserving the integrity of the vehicle and any evidence it contains. We treat this as a potential crime scene, and nothing gets disturbed unnecessarily." A specialized rescue boat with a floating crane was launched first. Steel cables and hydraulic pulleys were tested and readied. Divers in cold water gear checked oxygen tanks and communication systems one final time before entering the water. At 8:17 a.m., a whistle signaled the operation's start, and the first team of divers plunged into the murky Columbia. Below the surface, powerful underwater lights swept across the riverbed, seeking the vehicle that sonar had detected nearly 2 years earlier. Minutes stretched into an hour as the divers navigated the challenging conditions. Then, at 9:22 a.m., a crackle came over the radio. "Vehicle confirmed at coordinates. Ford SUV, green in color, heavily silted but intact. On the shore, Harlow clenched her fists, a mixture of anticipation and dread washing over her. After 18 years, they had found it, the missing piece in one of Oregon's most haunting mysteries. The recovery process proved painstakingly slow. Divers carefully attached steel cables to the SUV's frame, ensuring it wouldn't disintegrate during the ascent. Underwater cameras documented every step, capturing images that would later become crucial forensic evidence. It took nearly 3 hours to secure the vehicle properly. At 12:45 p.m., the crane operator began the delicate process of raising the SUV. The water surface erupted in white foam as the vehicle broke through after nearly 2 decades underwater. As the SUV rose from the depths, water cascaded from its rusted frame. Marine growth and silt clung to its surface like a creature dragged from another world. The once bright green paint had faded to a mottled, algae-covered gray, but the distinctive shape of a Ford Explorer was unmistakable. On shore, gasps echoed across the assembled police and recovery team. News photographers' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment for tomorrow's front pages. Police quickly raised tarps around the recovery area, shielding the vehicle from public view and protecting the dignity of what might be found inside. Forensic technicians approached in full protective gear as the crane gently lowered the SUV onto a waiting flatbed truck. The rear license plate, caked in mud and corrosion, was carefully cleaned. The numbers emerged. Oregon 3WP92, matching Warren Mason's registration exactly. There was no doubt now. This was the vehicle that had vanished on Christmas Eve 2003, carrying a family of 5. A heavy silence fell over the recovery team as attention turned to the interior of the SUV. The doors, swollen and rusted shut from years underwater, required specialized hydraulic equipment to open. When the rear door finally gave way with a sickening metallic groan, the stench of stagnant water and decomposition washed over those nearest. Inside, beneath thick layers of silt and mud, the worst fears were confirmed. Bone fragments appeared scattered across the backseat area. A tiny child's shoe with frayed laces lay on the floor. A rotted teddy bear, barely recognizable, had been preserved in the mud. And glinting in the midday sun, a silver ring emerged from the silt. The wedding band Katie Mason had worn for 14 years, now a cold testament to the family's final journey. Megan Harlow stepped forward, pulling on latex gloves before carefully examining the vehicle's mechanical components. The front airbags remained intact, never deployed, crucial evidence that immediately contradicted the accident theory. If the SUV had crashed into the water with enough force to overcome the guardrail, the airbags should have activated instantly. Even more telling was the condition of the rear door. Its lock showed signs of forced entry, long scratches around the mechanism, and a deformed latch suggesting external tampering. This wasn't consistent with a vehicle that had accidentally left the road. It pointed to deliberate human intervention. "This wasn't an accident," Harlow said quietly to Captain Reynolds, who had arrived to oversee the recovery. "The rear door's been forced. The airbags never deployed. Someone put this car in the water intentionally." The field report, typed later that day, stated the facts in clinical language. Human remains found inside vehicle, including juvenile remains. Recovered items include child's shoe, stuffed animal, silver ring, identified as belonging to Katie Mason. Airbags not deployed. Rear door shows signs of forced entry consistent with external tampering. The dry words couldn't capture the emotional weight that settled over everyone present. This wasn't just a recovered vehicle. It was a tomb, the final resting place of 5 people who had been searched for, grieved over, and remembered for 18 years. News of the recovery leaked within hours, despite police attempts to control information. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking reports. Mason family vehicle found after 18 years in Columbia River. Headlines flooded online news sites, accompanied by images of the algae-covered SUV being pulled from the depths. Social media erupted with thousands of comments from Oregonians who had grown up with the story, many expressing a complex mixture of grief and relief that the family had finally been found. Rebecca Cole collapsed into a chair when police called with the news. The words fragmented over the phone: "Vehicle recovered, remains inside, evidence of foul play." But she understood the essence. That night, she lit candles on her porch, their flickering light reflecting on a face aged by decades of unanswered pain. The next day, as police held a press conference announcing the discovery and confirming the vehicle contained human remains, Oregon was collectively shaken. Images of the rusted, shattered Ford Explorer aired nationwide. People wept silently while watching, many remembering the missing posters that had once papered store windows and telephone poles across the state. But alongside grief came another emotion: anger. If this wasn't an accident, if the evidence pointed to deliberate action, who could have cruelly pushed an entire family into the river on Christmas Eve? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer after 18 years of silence. As the SUV was transported to the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory in Salem, Megan Harlow stood watching the flatbed truck disappear down the highway. In her hand, she clutched a small evidence bag containing the silver wedding ring recovered from the vehicle, a tangible link to Katie Mason and a reminder of why this case mattered so much. The truth was finally emerging from the depths, but the investigation was far from over. Now began the painstaking process of extracting evidence from a vehicle that had spent almost 2 decades underwater, and the hunt for whoever was responsible for putting it there. The rusted Ford Explorer, retrieved from the Columbia River after 18 years, arrived at the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory in Salem under heavy security. On May 20th, 2021, in a sterile, climate-controlled room under harsh fluorescent lights, a team of specialized technicians began the painstaking work that had awaited them for nearly 2 decades. The vehicle was treated with extraordinary care, every door, every rusted metal piece, numbered, photographed, and meticulously cataloged. Thick mud and silt were carefully suctioned from the interior, using specialized vacuums that captured even the smallest particles for analysis. As the layers of sediment were removed, bone fragments emerged, mixed with degraded fabric and personal items. Each piece of remains was carefully lifted with sterile tweezers, placed in individual containers, and labeled with precise information about its location within the vehicle. The tension in the lab was palpable as technicians worked in near silence, the gravity of the moment weighing on everyone present. "We're not just processing evidence," the lead forensic scientist reminded her team. "We're bringing home a family that's been missing for 18 years. Every detail matters." The initial focus was on identification. DNA extracted from bone fragments and teeth was compared to samples collected in 2003, when Rebecca Cole had provided hair from brushes and blood samples for reference. Results returned 3 weeks later, confirming what everyone already suspected. The remains matched the Mason family: Warren, Katie, and their 3 children, Mason, Mia, and Mark. The scientific confirmation brought a wave of complex emotions. After 18 years, the question of whether the Mason family might still be alive somewhere was definitively answered. But with that certainty came the brutal truth that all 5 had been inside the SUV since that fateful Christmas Eve, trapped beneath the cold waters of the Columbia River. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the forensic pathologist who examined the remains, struggled to maintain her professional demeanor during the press briefing. "Based on the distribution and condition of the remains, we believe all 5 family members were inside the vehicle when it entered the water. Due to the extensive decomposition and environmental factors, determining exact cause of death is challenging, but drowning is the most likely primary cause." What she didn't say publicly, what was reserved for the investigative team, was that evidence suggested at least one family member had been injured before drowning. On the right rear seat, a dark brown stain had seeped deep into the upholstery. When treated with Kastle-Meyer reagent, it tested positive for human blood. DNA analysis matched the blood to 9-year-old Mia Mason. This discovery raised a chilling question. An injury or violent struggle had occurred before the car sank beneath the waters. It was another piece of evidence contradicting the accident theory that police had clung to for years. "This is consistent with assault, not a traffic accident," Megan Harlow noted in her case file, underlining the words twice. Equally significant was the forensic team's examination of the vehicle's mechanical components. Under powerful microscopes, experts studied the deformed rear door lock. Metal scratches on the mechanism showed distinct patterns consistent with forced entry using a tool like a screwdriver or pry bar. "The tool marks indicate external tampering," explained forensic engineer Dr. Robert Lynn, Someone forcibly locked this door from the outside, preventing it from being opened from inside the vehicle. This finding effectively demolished the accident theory. No natural crash could explain why someone would have tampered with the rear door lock. Combined with the undeployed airbags, the evidence painted a disturbing picture. The Explorer had been deliberately pushed or driven into the river with the family trapped inside. Perhaps most compelling was the discovery made by Dr. Amit Patel, a forensic technician specializing in fingerprint recovery from compromised surfaces. Using a groundbreaking technique recently developed at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Dr. Patel applied a chemical solution designed specifically for retrieving prints from objects submerged in water for extended periods. The river water's unique mineral composition actually helped preserve certain areas, Dr. Patel explained to Harlow. The mud created an anaerobic environment that protected some surfaces from complete degradation. As the solution dried on the rear door, handle, and lock mechanism, Dr. Patel switched on an ultraviolet light. Under its blue glow, faint fingerprint ridges emerged on the metal surface. Impressions that had survived 18 years underwater, now shimmering like ghostly raised veins. "We've got viable samples," he announced quietly, his voice betraying the significance of the moment. The prints were carefully photographed, enhanced digitally, and processed through AFIS, the FBI's automated fingerprint identification system. Within hours, the screen displayed the results, a 98.7% match with the fingerprints of Charlie Daniels. Megan Harlow stood motionless, staring at the screen. For 18 years, Daniels had been a shadow in witness statements, a suspicious figure at the cafe, a name that recurred throughout the investigation. Now, for the first time, physical evidence tied him directly to the vehicle, and not just anywhere on the vehicle, but to the tampered rear door lock. The AFS match seemed to echo through the laboratory. Match found, Charlie Daniels. In her interim report to the prosecutor, Harlow wrote, "Fingerprints on the rear door lock mechanism match Charlie Daniels. Blood on the rear seat belongs to Mia Mason, 9. Lock deformation indicates external tampering with intent to prevent escape. Combined evidence strongly suggests Daniels tampered with the vehicle before it entered the water." Reading through her own report, Harlow stepped away from her desk and into the hallway, taking deep breaths to steady herself. She thought of Rebecca Cole, who had maintained faith for nearly 2 decades that the truth would eventually emerge. Now Harlow could tell her that justice was finally finding its path. Yet her heart held not triumph, but a complex mixture of sadness and resolve. The evidence confirmed that a family's tragedy hadn't been a terrible accident, but a deliberate, cold-blooded crime. That evening, at a brief meeting with the cold case unit, Harlow presented her findings to Captain Reynolds and the investigative team, pointing to enlarged photos of the fingerprint match and blood evidence. "This is the first physical link between Daniels and the vehicle," she stated firmly. "It's the piece we lacked 18 years ago." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Reynolds nodded slowly. "Good work, Harlow. From this point forward, our official focus is Charlie Daniels." The forensic evidence wasn't yet public knowledge, but internally the investigation had turned a corner. For the first time since 2003, Daniels wasn't just a person of interest or a suspicious character. He was the prime suspect in what was now officially classified as the murder of 5 people. From that moment, the investigation entered its most intense phase, building an airtight case against a man who had evaded justice for nearly 2 decades. With Daniels' fingerprints confirmed on the Explorer's rear door lock, Megan Harlow turned her attention to an overlooked piece of evidence from the case's early days. While methodically reviewing items collected during the initial investigation, she discovered a notation about a revolver found by fishermen on the lower Columbia riverbank in February 2004, just weeks after the Mason family disappeared. The handgun, designated item number 04137, had been logged as potential evidence, but never definitively connected to the case. With no clear serial number and no obvious link to any known crime at the time, it had been stored in the evidence warehouse and essentially forgotten. Harlow immediately filed a request to retrieve the weapon from long-term storage. The process took nearly a week as staff searched through thousands of cataloged items in the Salem Evidence Facility. When the dust-covered box finally arrived, labeled simply Item 04137, handgun recovered Columbia River, Harlow felt a surge of anticipation. Inside lay a .38 caliber revolver, its steel mottled with rust. The wooden grip decayed but still intact. Decades underwater had taken their toll, but the weapon remained recognizable. Harlow photographed it carefully from all angles before submitting it to the forensic laboratory for re-examination with modern technology. In 2004, we simply didn't have the techniques to extract much information from an object in this condition, explained Dr. James Wilson, the weapons specialist assigned to the case. Today, we can do significantly more. The forensic team began by chemically treating the rusted surfaces, carefully removing corrosion while preserving any potential evidence beneath. They used a series of progressive solvents, each designed to penetrate deeper layers without damaging potential biological or fingerprint evidence. Next, they employed high-resolution imaging and laser scanning on the weapon's metal surfaces. Areas once deemed too degraded for analysis now revealed microscopic details under advanced equipment. In particular, the trigger and grip showed faint ridge patterns. Partial fingerprints preserved in microscopic corrosion patterns where skin oils had altered the metal's oxidation process. Though incomplete, the recovered fingerprint fragments were sufficient for analysis. The comparative results displayed on the laboratory monitor. Partial match. Charles Daniels. Confidence, 87%. Thus, not a perfect match like the prints found on the vehicle's door lock, but still highly significant. For nearly 2 decades, Charlie Daniels had evaded serious suspicion due to lack of physical evidence. Now, alongside fingerprints on the Explorer's rear door, there was a second connection linking him to a weapon discarded near the Columbia's lower banks just weeks after the Mason family's disappearance. Dr. Wilson's report stated, revolver item number 04137, recovered February 2004. Re-examination with current technology reveals partial fingerprints matching suspect Charles Daniels. Not conclusive in isolation, but strongly supportive when combined with other evidence in case file. Harlow theorized that if Daniels had attempted to clean up after forcing the Mason family into the river, this gun was the piece he had carelessly overlooked. Perhaps dropped accidentally or thrown in haste, landing on the riverbank rather than in the deeper water where it might never have been found. When Harlow presented the weapon analysis to State Prosecutor Ellen Clark, the African-American woman's expression remained impassive, but her eyes reflected intense focus. Clark had built her reputation on methodical case building and an unwavering commitment to justice. At 57, with nearly 3 decades of prosecution experience, she had seen countless murder cases, but the Mason family's story had touched her deeply. So we have fingerprints on the car's rear door lock, a witness placing him at the cafe in Hood River that night, and now partial prints on a gun found near the scene, Clark summarized, tapping a pencil against her legal pad. It's a compelling pattern, Detective. There's more, Harlow replied. The blood on the rear seat belonged to 9-year-old Mia Mason. This suggests violence before the drowning, possibly to subdue the family. Clark leaned back in her chair, considering. A defense attorney will argue the gun might not be connected to the case at all, just coincidentally found with Daniel's prints on it, and the prints on the pair could be explained by earlier casual contact, given that they were neighbors. But taken together with the witness statement in the tampered door lock, Harlow pressed. A smile slowly spread across Clark's face. Taken together, Detective Harlow, we have the beginning of a very strong circumstantial case. Not just a string of coincidences, but a clear thread leading straight to Charlie Daniels. News of the re-examined 2004 evidence spread quickly through law enforcement circles and eventually reached local media. Headlines appeared. Rusted gun may unlock Mason family mystery, and new technology revives crucial evidence in cold case. Public debate flared across Oregon. Some saw the fingerprint evidence as the final turning point in the case. Others worried that the incomplete results from the gun wouldn't hold up in court. Online forums dissected every leaked detail, amateur detectives offering theories and counter-theories about what might have happened on that foggy Christmas Eve. For Rebecca Cole, hearing from Harlow about the gun discovery brought a flood of emotions. If that's really his gun, she said through tears, then my sister and her children died at the hands of a cowardly killer who's been walking free for almost 20 years. I want him to answer for what he did. That evening in her office, Harlow taped a photo of the rusted revolver to her investigation board, drawing an arrow connecting Daniels to item number 4137. The web of evidence was growing denser by the day. The dead and threats, cafe presence, vehicle fingerprints, Mia's blood, the tampered door lock, and now the weapon. Each piece pointed in the same direction, creating a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. She sat for hours staring at the diagram, feeling both relief that justice was approaching and the weight of responsibility for ensuring the case was airtight. Closing her file for the night, Harlow wrote in her investigation log, "For the first time in 18 years, we have physical evidence tying Daniels directly to the crime. The next battle, interrogation." The pieces were falling into place. Now it was time to confront the man who had potentially harbored this dark secret for nearly 2 decades. On September 14th, 2021, after weeks of meticulous preparation, Charlie Chuck Daniels was summoned to Oregon State Police headquarters in Portland for formal questioning. The 63-year-old man, still stocky but slightly stooped with age, entered the building wearing wrinkled khaki pants and a faded blue button-down shirt. His hairline had receded significantly since 2003, and deep lines marked his face, but the cold intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. This wasn't Daniel's first time being questioned about the Mason family. He'd been interviewed multiple times in 2004, but this time was different. He faced Detective Megan Harlow, armed with evidence tight enough to close the net that had been slowly drawing around him for 18 years. The interrogation room was deliberately sparse. A metal table bolted to the floor, 4 chairs, and a one-way mirror on the wall. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows, an environmental technique designed to create psychological discomfort. A digital recorder sat prominently on the table, its red light blinking steadily. Daniel sat with arms crossed defensively, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "We're playing this game again?" he asked as Harlow entered with a thick file folder. "I told the police years ago I had nothing to do with that family." Harlow didn't respond immediately. She methodically arranged her materials, then opened the file and removed a large color photograph showing fingerprints highlighted in fluorescent blue against the dark metal of the Explorer's rear door lock. "Mr. Daniels," she said evenly, "these fingerprints, matching yours, were found on the rear door lock of the Mason family's Ford Explorer, the same door that shows evidence of forced tampering. How do you explain that?" Daniels glanced briefly at the photo, then laughed hoarsely. "That's nonsense. That car was underwater for nearly 20 years. You expect me to believe you got prints off it? Maybe I touched their car once. They were neighbors, for Christ's sake." Harlow nodded, then placed another photograph on the table. The rusted revolver, item number 04137. This gun was pulled from the Columbia River in February 2004, just weeks after the Mason family disappeared. We've found partial fingerprints matching yours on the trigger and grip. How do you explain your weapon being discarded near where the car entered the water?" Daniels frowned, silent for a moment. Then he shrugged dismissively. "I've never owned a gun like that. Someone's trying to pin this on me." Harlow maintained her calm demeanor, voice level but eyes sharp, as she produced Linda Cross's sworn statement and the sketch she'd made of the man in the cafe. "Linda Cross, the waitress at River's Edge Cafe, has confirmed seeing you on December 24th, 2003, watching the Mason family with what she described as hatred. She identified you from a photo lineup with 94% confidence. What do you say to that?" Daniels' smile faded, his posture becoming more rigid. "Some old lady's mixed up memories after 18 years? You're building a case on that?" His voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. The tension in the room grew palpable. Harlow knew from Daniel's psychological profile that he was volatile and prone to verbal slips when agitated. She deliberately shifted tactics, softening her tone to appear almost conversational. "What haunts me, Mr. Daniels, is the red wool scarf," she said, studying his face carefully. "Do you remember it? The tiny red scarf that 5-year-old Mark Mason wore that night. We found it in the car, soaked in mud. Do you know where it was before the car sank?" For a brief moment, Daniels blinked rapidly, then muttered, "The scarf, it fell on the car floor." He stopped abruptly, but it was too late. Harlow leaned forward, eyes locked on his. "What did you say?" she asked quietly. "You mentioned the scarf on the car floor. How would you know where it was when only the Mason family was in the car that night?" Daniels's face flushed dark red. He slammed his palm against the table. "You're setting me up. I didn't say anything about any scarf." Harlow maintained her composure, voice steady but relentless. "No one's setting you up, Mr. Daniels. You said it yourself. You knew a detail only someone inside that car would know. Your fingerprints are on the rear door lock, the same lock that was tampered with to prevent escape. 9-year-old Mia's blood is on the back seat. And now you've mentioned the red scarf's location. It's over. You can't run from the truth anymore." The room seemed to grow smaller, the air heavier. The recorder hummed steadily, capturing every word. Daniels began to sweat profusely, eyes darting around as if seeking escape. I heard someone mention it," he stammered weakly. "I must have heard it somewhere." But the excuse convinced no one, least of all himself. His slip had revealed intimate knowledge of the crime scene, knowledge that only the killer could possess. As the interrogation continued for another hour, Daniels grew increasingly agitated, contradicting himself multiple times and offering implausible explanations for the mounting evidence. When Harlow finally ended the session, Daniels was visibly shaken, his earlier arrogance replaced by palpable fear. Outside the interrogation room, Harlow exhaled deeply, steadying herself against the wall. She knew they hadn't secured a full confession, but Daniels's inadvertent revelation about the red scarf was damning. Beyond physical evidence, the suspect had now demonstrated specific knowledge of the crime scene that could only come from direct involvement. Her report to Captain Reynolds noted, "Daniels denies all charges but inadvertently revealed knowledge of Mark Mason's red scarf location inside the vehicle. Information not publicly released and only available to someone present during the crime. This indicates direct crime scene knowledge. Recommend preparing for arrest warrant." In the dimly lit hallway of OSP headquarters, Harlow looked through a window at Portland's rainy streets. After 18 years, the truth was emerging from the fog that had concealed it for so long. One more step would bring Charlie Daniels face to face with justice for his actions on that cold Christmas Eve. The next phase would be crucial, turning compelling evidence into an airtight case that could withstand the scrutiny of a court trial and finally provide answers to a community that had waited nearly 2 decades for closure. On March 7, 2024, Wasco County Courthouse in the Dalles became the focal point of national attention. From early morning, hundreds of people lined up outside, hoping to secure seats in the public gallery. News vans with satellite dishes crowded the street, and reporters delivered live updates against the backdrop of the historic courthouse. The trial of Charlie Chuck Daniels, accused of murdering the Mason family on Christmas Eve 2003, had been deemed one of Oregon's most significant trials in decades. After 2 years of legal preparations, evidence gathering, and pretrial motions, the case that had haunted the state for over 20 years was finally reaching its resolution. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with tension. The 12-person jury, 7 women and 5 men, carefully selected through weeks of vetting, sat solemnly in the jury box. Prosecutor Ellen Clark and her team arranged files and exhibits at their table, while Daniels sat beside his public defender, dressed in a gray suit that hung loosely on his frame, his face tense and pallid. Among the spectators, Rebecca Cole sat in the front row, clutching a framed photograph of her sister's family. Behind her, Detective Megan Harlow watched with steely focus, ready to testify about the evidence that had finally brought this case to trial. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Judge William Hargrove entered, and the courtroom rose. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The State of Oregon versus Charles Daniels." The trial began with opening statements. Prosecutor Clark approached the jury with measured steps, her voice resonating with controlled emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a family, Warren and Katie Mason and their children, Mason, Mia, and Mark, who disappeared on Christmas Eve 2003. For nearly 20 years, their fate remained unknown. Today, we will show beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant, Charlie Daniels, deliberately murdered this family to avoid repaying a debt and in response to perceived humiliation." Clark methodically outlined the state's case: the financial motive, the witness placing Daniels at the cafe, the fingerprints on the door lock, the blood evidence, the recovered gun, and Daniels' own incriminating statement during interrogation. The evidence will show that this was not an accident, but a calculated act of violence against an entire family, including 3 innocent children on Christmas Eve. We ask you to listen carefully, examine the facts, and deliver the justice that has been delayed for 2 decades. The defense countered with a narrative of reasonable doubt, suggesting that while the Masons' deaths were tragic, they resulted from an accidental slide into the river during treacherous winter conditions. They argued that Daniel's fingerprints on the vehicle could be explained by casual contact as neighbors, and that the gun evidence was circumstantial at best. The prosecution wants you to believe that my client somehow forced 5 people into a car and into the river without anyone seeing or hearing anything, the defense attorney argued. What really happened was a terrible accident that the state is trying to transform into murder. Over the following days, witnesses took the stand one by one. When Linda Cross appeared, the courtroom fell silent. Now in her 60s with silver-streaked blonde hair, she walked steadily to the witness box. Under oath, she recounted that fateful night in December 2003, the Mason family entering her cafe, the 3 children chattering excitedly, and the large brown-haired man in the corner watching Warren Mason with unmistakable hostility. That look wasn't casual curiosity, she testified, her voice unwavering. It was full of hatred, the kind that makes you uncomfortable even as a bystander. I've never forgotten it. Pointing directly at the defendant, she added, "That man was Charlie Daniels. I'm certain of it." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Daniels whispered urgently to his lawyer, who reminded him to maintain composure. On the 4th day, the forensic team presented their findings. They projected enlarged images of the Explorer's rear door lock, highlighting the scratches and deformation. This indicates forced tampering, not damage from an accident, the forensic engineer testified. Someone deliberately prevented this door from being opened from the inside. They showed the fingerprint evidence, glowing blue ridges from the door lock with the AFIS match result displayed on screen, 98.7% match to Charlie Daniels. Then came the partial prints from the rusted revolver, item number 4137, recovered from the Columbia Riverbank in 2004. The combination of these evidence points creates a consistent pattern, the forensic expert explained. The fingerprints, the tampered lock, the weapon found near the scene all connect the defendant to this crime. The defense fought back, arguing that submersion in river water for 18 years made forensic evidence unreliable. How can we trust fingerprints from a vehicle that spent nearly 2 decades underwater? The margin for error is simply too great. But when the prosecution pressed, how do you explain fingerprints specifically on a forced lock mechanism? And why was a gun with the defendant's prints found near the site shortly after the disappearance? The defense attorney stumbled, while Daniels visibly tensed, knuckles white as he gripped the table edge. Midway through the trial, Megan Harlow testified as the lead investigative officer. She detailed the process of reviewing the case, noting Daniels' recurring presence throughout the investigation and explaining how modern technology had revived evidence that once thought lost. Was this an accident, as the defense claims? The prosecutor asked. Harlow faced the jury squarely. No, this was a deliberate crime, planned and executed with intent, then concealed for nearly 2 decades. The climactic moment came on day 10 when the recording of Daniels' interrogation was played. His inadvertent slip about Mark Mason's red scarf echoed through the hushed courtroom. The scarf. It fell on the car floor. The prosecution drove home the significance. This is a detail only someone who was present at the scene would know, a detail not released to the public. The defendant incriminated himself with his own words. Daniel suddenly stood, shouting, "You trapped me! I didn't kill anyone!" The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, while jurors exchanged shocked glances at the outburst. On day 14, the prosecution delivered its closing argument. Ellen Clark stood before the jury, her presence commanding attention. The evidence presents an undeniable conclusion. Charlie Daniels had motive, a $15,000 debt to Warren Mason. He was identified by a witness at the Hood River Cafe, watching the family with hostility. His fingerprints are on the tampered rear door lock and on a gun recovered near the scene. The forced lock proves deliberate interference with the vehicle. And by his own words, he revealed knowledge of the crime scene that only the perpetrator could possess. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. This wasn't an accident. It was the deliberate taking of 5 lives, a husband, a wife, and 3 children, whose only mistake was trusting a man who valued $15,000 more than their lives. The defense's final plea clung desperately to the accident theory, but after 2 weeks of damning testimony and physical evidence, it sounded increasingly hollow. During the closing arguments, Daniels grew visibly agitated, twice being warned by the judge for disruptive behavior, further damaging his image with the jury. When the judge finally adjourned for jury deliberations, the courtroom exhaled collectively after days of mounting tension. Outside, media broadcast live updates with millions across America following the case that had captivated Oregon for over 20 years. For 3 days, the jury reviewed crime scene photographs, replayed Linda Cross's testimony, analyzed forensic reports, and debated the significance of Daniel's slip about the red scarf. The deliberation room often grew heated, with jurors arguing the merits of circumstantial evidence versus the defense's accident theory. If we let him go, what message do we send to other families waiting for justice, one juror asked, a question that silenced the room before debates resumed. On March 24, 2024, at 6:17 p.m., the jury reached their verdict, guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. The recommendation, life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing, held 1 week later, drew an even larger crowd. The Dalles courthouse was packed beyond capacity, with many watching via large screens set up outside. Daniels was led in, handcuffed and haggard, his eyes vacant as he faced the consequences of actions taken 20 years earlier. Judge Hargrove's voice carried clearly as he delivered the sentence. Defendant Charles Daniels, the jury has found you guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. This court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for each count, to be served consecutively. The words landed with finality. Daniel slumped in his chair, muttering incoherently while his lawyer bowed his head, acknowledging the fight was over. Rebecca Cole was invited to make a victim impact statement. She walked slowly to the front, clutching the Mason family photograph that had become iconic in Oregon over the years. Her voice broke with emotion but remained strong. 20 years, 20 empty Christmases, 20 years of wondering, hoping, praying. Today, justice has finally called my sister's name, my brother-in-law's name, my nieces' and nephews' names. They can't come home, but the truth has. The courtroom fell silent before erupting in applause. Many wept openly, including jurors and court officers who had maintained stoic professionalism throughout the trial. Media reported instantly, justice after 20 years, Daniels sentenced to life without parole. National television showed Rebecca clutching the family photograph, her face reflecting both pain and peace. Outside the courthouse, hundreds waited in the spring rain, hugging and crying upon hearing the verdict. We didn't forget them, an elderly woman told a reporter. Justice may come late, but it came. At the prosecutor's table, Megan Harlow felt the weight of years lift from her shoulders. As Daniels was led away by court officers, she watched not with triumph but with solemn satisfaction. No sentence could bring the Mason family back, but the truth was no longer buried in the Columbia's depths. That evening, the Mason case file received its final stamp. Closed. Conviction. At a Portland cemetery, Rebecca placed white roses on a new memorial for her sister's family, whispering, "We made it to the end, and justice found you." In fall 2024, the Columbia Gorge returned to its quiet beauty. The river churned as it always had, cliffs shrouded in evening mist, but it no longer held the secret that had haunted Oregon for over 2 decades. Near the Dalles Marina, where the rusted explorer was raised, a granite memorial now stood, inscribed simply, "The Mason Family, December 24th, 2003, never forgotten." Visitors regularly paused to lay flowers or simply touch the cold stone, sharing in a loss that had become part of Oregon's collective memory. In November, at a statewide law enforcement conference in Salem, Megan Harlow was invited to deliver the opening address. Under the spotlights, her blonde hair now showing touches of premature gray from the stress of the investigation, she spoke briefly but powerfully. No case is too old. No file deserves to be forgotten. If we persist, if we leverage new technologies, if the community stands with us, justice may come late, but it never vanishes completely. The audience rose in a standing ovation, young officers looking at her with admiration, taking her words as a professional creed for their own careers. In Portland, Rebecca Cole continued her personal journey toward healing. After the verdict, she had received permission to establish a shared memorial for her sister, brother-in-law, and their 3 children. On the 21st anniversary of their disappearance, she placed white roses on the gravestone, whispering words only she could hear. The autumn wind rustled through nearby trees, leaves falling gently around her. For the first time in over 20 years, Rebecca felt a fragile peace taking root where grief had dominated for so long. Oregon's community emerged changed from the case. Families with missing loved ones found renewed hope that answers might someday come, regardless of how much time had passed. The phrase "never too old for justice" appeared on police station walls and became integrated into training programs for new recruits. The Mason case became a cornerstone in Oregon forensic curricula, demonstrating how sonar technology, advanced DNA analysis, and relentless investigation could revive a case thought forever dormant. National television produced multiple documentaries featuring interviews with Harlow, Rebecca, and the original investigators from 2003. One October afternoon, Harlow drove alone along Highway 84, stopping at the overlook near where the Mason car had been found. She stood silently at the guardrail, watching the Columbia River flow endlessly beneath, its surface reflecting the deep purple of the evening sky. In her personal journal that night, she wrote, "I'll never forget this case, not just for a family's pain, but for the lesson it taught us all. No case should fall into oblivion. No victim should be forgotten. No truth should remain submerged forever." As Oregon bathed in autumn's golden hues, communities from the Dalles to Hood River to Portland shared a collective feeling. The Mason case hadn't just closed a file, it had opened a belief, the belief that truth can be buried but never erased, and that justice, though sometimes 20 years late, arrives with the persistence of those unwilling to let memory fade. Like the Columbia River itself, justice had continued flowing, unstoppable despite the passage of time, eventually wearing away the barriers that had hidden the truth for so long. The Mason family story and their 20-year journey to justice would forever echo along the Columbia River Gorge, gentle but enduring, illuminating a community that had waited too long but had never given up hope.